Some men raise a glass to celebrate. That night, I raised mine to hold on to every single word being said about my daughter while everyone at the table assumed I was too pleasant, too quiet, too far out of my depth to notice any of it. Smile, Walter. Just smile and pour the wine. I want to tell you about that dinner. Not because it makes me proud, and not because I want sympathy. I want to tell you because I think most fathers, if they're honest, have sat in a room like that at least once in their lives. A room where your child is being measured by people who've already decided what she's worth, and you're expected to sit there and let it happen. If you were sitting at that table listening to people talk about your child as though she were a decision to be managed rather than a person to be loved, what would you have done? Would you have said something right away? Or would you have done what I did and waited and listened until the moment was right? Stay with me. I promise you, by the end of this, you'll understand exactly why I set my fork down that night and why I've never once regretted it. Welcome back to Dad's True Tales. If you're new here, I share honest stories from my own life, the kind that don't always have a clean, happy ending, but always have something true in them. If you enjoy stories about fathers, daughters, and the quiet dignity it sometimes takes to hold a family together, stay a while. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. I read every one of them. Now let me tell you about my daughter, and why that night mattered so much before I tell you what happened during it. Her name is Claire, and there is nothing between the day she was born and this very moment that I remember more clearly than the small, ordinary hours I spent with her. I remember her tiny hand wrapped around one of my fingers in the hospital, 3 days after she was born too early, when I was too afraid to close my eyes in case something changed while I wasn't watching. I remember teaching her to ride a bike on the flat stretch of road in front of our house, letting go of the seat a dozen times before she finally realized I already had. I remember her mother, Margaret, standing in the kitchen doorway watching us, laughing at how many times I claimed I was about to let go for real this time. Claire is a nurse now. She works nights in a cardiac unit, the kind of job that asks everything of a person and rarely says thank you back. When her mother got sick 4 years ago, Claire was the one who sat beside her hospital bed after her own 12-hour shifts, holding her mother's hand until she fell asleep in the chair beside her. I have never in my life seen strength like that, and I have built an entire career sitting across tables from people who thought strength meant something else entirely. So when Claire called me 2 years ago, her voice bright in a way I hadn't heard since before Margaret passed, to tell me she'd met someone, I felt something in my chest loosen that I hadn't realized had been tight for years. His name was Julian. He was kind to her in the small, steady ways that matter more than anything loud or impressive. He asked her questions and actually waited for the answers. He remembered small details about her mother, about her work, about the version of herself she'd built after grief had tried to take it from her. When he asked her to marry him last spring, I didn't need convincing that he loved her. I'd already seen it in 100 small moments over 2 years. What I wanted, more than almost anything, was for Claire to sit at that dinner table and look around at the people gathered there, her fiancé, his parents, her own father, and see her whole world sitting in one room, finally whole again. That is why the dinner mattered so much. Not because of who Julian's family was, or what they had built, or what impression they might form of a man who ran his business out of a modest office in the Midwest. It mattered because my daughter wanted, more than anything, for the people she loved to feel like one family instead of 2 separate worlds meeting politely across a white tablecloth. That I would have done almost anything to give her that. Claire had spent weeks preparing. She picked the restaurant herself, a quiet, well-regarded steakhouse downtown with dark wood paneling and low lighting. The kind of place that plays soft music you can barely notice unless you're listening for it. She wanted everything to feel right. She wanted Julian's parents to see the same thing in our small family that Julian had apparently seen in her. The week before the dinner, she called me almost every evening. She'd ask what I planned to wear. She'd ask if I remembered certain stories about her childhood, in case they came up in conversation. She wanted to make sure I understood which fork was which I let her explain without correcting her, because it seemed to comfort her more than the actual information did. The morning of the dinner, I drove out to the small cemetery on the edge of town, the way I do most difficult mornings, and sat by Margaret's headstone for a while. I told her about the dinner. I told her I wished she could be there to hold Claire's hand under the table the way she always used to at nervous family gatherings. Then I drove home, put on the same navy suit I'd worn to Margaret's funeral, because it was the only suit I owned that still fit properly, and I drove into the city. The restaurant was exactly the kind of place Claire described. Warm lighting, dark wood paneling, the low hum of quiet conversation drifting between tables. Waiters moved carefully between the room, carrying trays with the kind of practiced calm you only see in places that have been doing this for a long time. Claire was already there when I arrived, standing near the entrance in a soft green dress, her hands twisting together the way they used to when she was young and nervous before a piano recital. She hugged me tightly. "They're already at the table," she whispered. "Please be yourself. Please don't try too hard." I smiled and told her I had no intention of trying at all. Julian's parents were seated at a round table near the back of the restaurant, the kind reserved for parties that wanted a bit of privacy. Klaus stood as we approached, tall, silver-haired, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than my first car. Ingrid remained seated, offering a polite, thin smile and a light handshake, her rings catching the candlelight as she extended her hand. "Walter," Klaus said, his English precise and formal. "It is good to finally meet Claire's father." "The pleasure is mine," I said, and took my seat. For the first 20 minutes, everything felt pleasant enough. We talked about the flight from Stuttgart, about the weather, about Claire and Julian's plans for a small wedding next spring. Julian sat close to Claire the entire time, his hand occasionally finding hers under the table, and I could see how much he cared for her in the small, ordinary ways that matter more than grand gestures. But somewhere around the appetizers, I began to notice small things. Klaus's eyes moved across the restaurant, across my suit, across the modest watch on my wrist, with the kind of quick, practiced assessment that people make when they're used to sizing up a room. Ingrid asked polite questions about my work, and when I described myself simply as someone who ran a manufacturing and machining business, her expression shifted slightly, the way a person's face shifts when they've decided a conversation isn't worth pursuing any further. They weren't rude. Not outwardly. Everything remained composed and formal. But I have spent enough years sitting across negotiating tables to recognize the particular quiet that settles over a room when someone has already decided you don't matter much to the conversation. That it happened gradually, the way these things usually do. Somewhere around the main course, Klaus and Ingrid began speaking more directly to Julian, almost as though Claire and I were guests at a meeting rather than the two people the meeting was actually about. They spoke plainly, in English, but with a certain ease that told me they'd stopped considering how their words might land. I think they had decided, without ever saying so, that a man who ran a small operation out of the Midwest wouldn't follow the finer points of what they were discussing, and that even if I did, I wouldn't have the standing to say anything about it. That I said nothing. I simply nodded and continued eating. Ingrid asked Julian, in a tone that was calm and almost businesslike, whether he and Claire had discussed a prenuptial agreement yet. Julian, a little startled, replied quietly that they hadn't discussed anything like that it felt unnecessary given how much he loved her. Klaus responded, his voice even but firm, that it was never unnecessary when a family's business and property were involved, especially when marrying into a family with, as he put it, no comparable standing in that world. Claire glanced at me apologetically, her face flushing, clearly uncomfortable but unsure how to redirect the conversation without embarrassing everyone at the table. Julian, to his credit, seemed caught off guard by his parents, glancing between them and Claire with growing discomfort of his own. That I kept eating. I kept my expression calm. I had spent enough years in boardrooms to know that the first person to react is rarely the one who ends up in control of the conversation. Then the conversation moved fully onto Claire. Ingrid added, almost gently, as though she believed she was being reasonable rather than cruel, that Claire seemed like a lovely girl, but that she came from a very different world, and that these kinds of marriages required careful planning to protect what the family had spent generations building. Then Klaus said something I will remember for the rest of my life. He said that Claire was clearly a practical choice for Julian in some ways, kind, agreeable, easy to bring into the family, but that she would need guidance adjusting to their world, the way one might describe training a promising new employee rather than welcoming a daughter into a family. Ingrid nodded and added that it was fortunate Claire seemed unlikely to cause complications, unlike some of the more independent, difficult women Julian had brought home in the past. That I felt something tighten in my chest, the same feeling I remembered from the hospital room the night Claire was born. That fierce, wordless instinct to protect her from anything that might hurt her. I set down my fork. I want you to understand something about that moment. I wasn't deciding whether to be angry. The anger was already there, quiet and steady beneath my ribs. What I was actually deciding was how to respond to it, because there is a very old lesson my father taught me at our kitchen table, decades before any of this happened. He used to say that a man who raises his voice has already lost the argument before he's finished making it, so I didn't raise my voice. That I folded my napkin carefully, set it beside my plate, and looked up at Klaus and Ingrid with the same calm expression I'd worn through the entire dinner. Then I spoke, plainly and without any hesitation, in the same even tone they had used to speak about my daughter. I asked them whether they always discussed people this way in front of them, or whether tonight was simply a special occasion. The silence that followed was unlike any silence I've experienced before or since. Klaus's face went through several expressions in the span of about 2 seconds: surprise, then something closer to genuine discomfort. Ingrid's hand froze halfway to her wine glass. Claire looked at me, startled, unsure where this steadiness in my voice had come from, though she had certainly seen glimpses of it in me before. Julian looked back and forth between his parents and me, slowly understanding the weight of what had just been said at his own engagement dinner. I continued speaking calmly and clearly, so there could be no confusion about what I meant. This was the first time that evening I told them anything about the life I'd actually built. I told them that I had spent close to 15 years doing business with manufacturing firms across Germany, sitting in the same kinds of formal rooms their own company likely used, negotiating contracts with people who judged a man by the precision of his work rather than the cut of his suit. I told them I understood, better than most, how much history and labor goes into building something that lasts generations, because I had built something myself quietly over 40 years without ever needing anyone's permission or approval to know its worth. I told them that my daughter was not a practical choice, or an agreeable arrangement, or a girl who required guidance to be worthy of their family's name. She was a woman who had built her own career as a nurse, who had held her mother's hand through the final months of her life without ever once complaining about the weight of it, who had more strength and grace in her than most people manage to gather in a lifetime. I told them that if their family's success required marrying someone they considered beneath them, in order to feel secure in it, then perhaps their family had less to offer than they believed. I did not raise my voice once. I did not stand up. I simply spoke the truth, plainly, at the same table where they had assumed no one would push back, and let it sit in the space between us. Klaus was the first to speak after a long, uncomfortable pause. He apologized, stiffly at first, then more genuinely as the weight of what he'd said seemed to settle over him. He admitted that he and Ingrid had made assumptions about our family based on very little, and that those assumptions had been unfair and unkind. Ingrid said very little. Her face remained flushed, and she avoided my eyes for the rest of the evening, though she did offer a quiet apology to Claire directly, which I noticed Claire accepted with more grace than I think I could have managed at her age. Julian, to his credit, was visibly upset with his parents. He apologized to Claire repeatedly, clearly mortified, and told his parents plainly that their behavior had embarrassed him more than he could express. The rest of the dinner was quiet, subdued, everyone moving carefully around the conversation that had just taken place. I didn't gloat. I didn't bring it up again. I finished my meal, thanked the staff, and drove Claire home myself instead of letting her ride with Julian's family, because I wanted a few quiet minutes with my daughter after everything that had happened. In the car, she cried for a while, not from sadness exactly, but from the release of something she'd been holding on to all evening. She thanked me, over and over, for understanding, for staying calm, for not embarrassing her the way she'd feared a confrontation might. I told her the truth. I told her I hadn't done it for myself. I'd done it because no one, not even people with factories and old family names, gets to speak about my daughter that way in front of me and expect silence in return. I think about that dinner often, more than a year later now. I've come to understand that it wasn't really about proving anything to Klaus and Ingrid, or demonstrating that I was more capable or accomplished than they'd assumed. It was about something much simpler than that. It was about making sure my daughter never had to wonder, even for a moment, whether her father would stay silent while someone diminished her worth in front of him. Have you ever sat in a room and listened to someone speak about a person you loved as though they didn't matter, assuming you either wouldn't notice or wouldn't say anything? I think more of us carry a version of that memory than we usually admit out loud. I'd be glad to hear about it, if you're willing to share it in the comments. For me, The lesson wasn't about revealing hidden strength or surprising people who'd underestimated me. I've had plenty of moments like that over the years, in business meetings, in negotiations, in rooms full of people who looked at my modest clothes and assumed there wasn't much behind them. Those moments used to satisfy something in me. This one didn't feel like that at all. This one felt like something quieter and more important. It felt like keeping a promise I made the night Claire was born. Sitting beside her hospital crib, terrified and unsure of almost everything. Except one thing, that I would protect her in whatever way I was able to, for as long as I was alive to do it. Things did change after that dinner, gradually and honestly. Klaus reached out to me privately a few weeks later, asking if we could speak by phone. It was an awkward conversation at first, but a genuine one. He admitted that his own upbringing had taught him to measure people by their business standing and family name long before he ever had the chance to know them as individuals, and that he regretted allowing that habit to shape how he treated Claire before truly getting to know her over the following months. As the wedding planning continued, Ingrid made a quiet effort to get to know Claire properly, asking about her work as a nurse, about her mother, about the small details of her life that had nothing to do with family names or business standing. It wasn't a dramatic transformation. It was slow and careful, the way real change usually is. Claire and Julian were married last spring, in a small ceremony not far from where Margaret is buried, so that I could feel close to her that day too. Klaus gave a toast at the reception, and this time he spoke about Claire directly, about her strength and her kindness, and about how grateful he was that his son had found someone who challenged his family to grow rather than simply fitting quietly into what already existed. I sat near the back of the room that evening, in the same navy suit, watching my daughter dance with her new husband, and I thought about how strange it is that sometimes the most important thing a father can do for his child isn't loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's simply staying calm, staying dignified, and refusing to let someone else's cruelty define the room. That I've thought a great deal about what I would tell another father facing a similar moment. Someone sitting quietly at a table while people underestimate him or the people he loves, that I would tell him this. You don't need to raise your voice to be heard. You don't need to prove your worth through wealth or status or credentials. The truth, spoken calmly and without apology, carries more weight in a room than anger ever will. And I would tell him that protecting the people you love doesn't always look like a dramatic confrontation. Sometimes it looks like listening carefully, waiting for the right moment, and then speaking plainly with your dignity fully intact, so that everyone in the room understands exactly who you are and exactly what you will not allow to be said in your presence. That I want to ask you something before you go tonight. If you were sitting at that table and you heard people speak about your daughter that way, what would you have done? Would you have spoken up right away? Or would you have waited the way I did, and let the truth arrive calmly in its own time? Do you think I made the right decision that night? I genuinely love to know what you think, so please share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're willing, let me know where you're watching this from. It means more to me than you probably realize to know how far these stories travel, and who's sitting with me while I tell them. If this story moved you, please consider like this video and subscribe for more stories like it. I share these because I believe there's something worth learning in almost every difficult night a family lives through, and I'm grateful every time someone takes the time to listen. Until next time, take care of the people who truly love you, and never be afraid to speak the truth calmly, even when it takes courage to do so. Thank you.